I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. Today we're looking at 3 CMOS cameras. CMOS is a new camera technology with a high resolution, wide dynamic range, and a few other things about it that isn't so good, but it's the new camera technology and all the manufacturers are releasing it. We've got the RunCam Eagle 2 Pro, which is one of my favorites, and 2 cameras from Foxeer, the Foxeer Monster, and their newest camera, the Foxeer Predator. Stay tuned. There's really no question in my mind that CMOS sensors are where the FPV camera market is going. CMOS sensors are the kind of sensor that's in the cameras that we're looking at today. And the good part about CMOS sensors is they can produce much higher resolution images, and they can do really fancy things like wide dynamic range that CCD sensors, can they not do it? I don't know, but they don't. All the cameras that we see with these awesome features are CMOS sensors. CMOS sensors have a little bit of a bad reputation in FPV. It turns out you can make a CMOS sensor really cheaply, and for a long time, the cheapest, worst FPV cameras you could buy, the ones you find on just the bottom dollar ready-to-fly quads, were CMOS cameras. And so people came to associate CMOS with cheap, terrible cameras. But it's not like that. It's just a coincidence that it was that way. CMOS can be very good. You just have to do some post-processing of the image. And that's what we see the cameras in this Shootout and other CMOS cameras on the market doing. The CMOS sensor outputs the raw data, and then you do the fancy processing to get things like wide dynamic range, very high resolution, better color, etc., and you get a good image. For a while, CMOS cameras also had problems with latency. The same processing that gave you the wide dynamic range and all the other fancy things also increased latency. But modern CMOS cameras have got latency down. They're still not quite as fast as CCD cameras, but they're as fast as some CCD cameras that people were happy with. So we've got some CCD cameras now that have got resolution down into, say, the low 20 millisecond range. Whereas CMOS cameras today, the most recent ones are in maybe the high 20s. So they're still a little bit slower, but if you go back and you look at the original RunCam Swift, it was in the high 20 millisecond latency range and nobody complained about it. So basically the latency question, I think, is settled, and it's only going to get better from here. Now we've got 3 cameras in this roundup, 3 CMOS cameras. The first is the RunCam Eagle Pro V2, and it is, well, the Eagle is probably my favorite camera. The Eagle Pro V2, I go back and forth on whether I like it better than the Eagle 2, but both of them are really good cameras. And for the longest time, people have been saying to me, you got to check out the Monster, the Foxeer Monster, because the RunCam Eagle 2 has some issues. It has an over-sharpened image that creates this weird shimmering distortion, and it has aliasing. In previous videos, I've been calling it Moire artifacting. People have told me that it really is more like aliasing, and Moire is kind of an example of aliasing. Well, anyway, never mind. The image on the Eagle has a lot of things to like about it, but also some things to really dislike, and some people just reject it totally as a result. And people say the Monster doesn't have those problems, so we're going to see if that's true. The other camera is the Predator, which is also from Foxeer. It's the newest one, and presumably it's going to take the place of the Monster. I don't know. It's newer technology, and we'll see how it stacks up as well. And then I've got the Foxeer Arrow, and one nice thing about it is that it's a CCD camera, so we can sort of compare a CCD image with a CMOS image, but really it's only in the roundup because I needed a 4th camera to round out my quadrant on screen. I didn't want just dead space in one corner, so I just grabbed it and tossed it in. Now the Foxeer Arrow is a micro, so it's got a much smaller lens. It's got a plastic lens. It's really not a fair fight at all, but it's not even supposed to be here, so it's just filling space, so don't worry. And in order to go through the footage, I think the easiest thing to do is going to be to pull it up in Premiere and just sort of scrub through it in the timeline so we can easily find what we want to see. And also Premiere has this cool multi-camera feature where I can step through the individual cameras one by one. So that's super cool. So that's what we're going to do. And I realize that means that you're not going to be seeing quite a full screen image, but ultimately this is a 1080p screen, and these are not 1080p cameras. So I don't think we're going to be losing too much by giving up just a little bit of screen resolution. Now, I posted the raw video to my channel yesterday or the day before, and another thing that you guys criticized me for a little bit was that these cameras are at their default settings. The exception is the RunCam Eagle 2 Pro. I turned the sharpening down on the Eagle 2 Pro because it reduces a little bit of the shimmering artifacts, and I do that. I run this camera enough that I know that's what I'm going to do. And you can see the shimmering is still there, but it's not quite as bad as you might have otherwise seen. The main reason that I did that is that I actually played with the image settings on the other cameras. Well, not the micro, because the micro's not really in this review, right? But I played with the image settings on the Monster and the Predator to try to address some of the things you're going to hear me complain about, and I didn't find that it made a freaking difference. And I'm going to show you an example of that later in the video, but for now, I want you to trust me that I did play with these settings and try and address some of the things that I'm going to complain about. And what you see, I ended up back on the defaults because I didn't feel like any of the changes I made actually made things very much better. To me, the RunCam Eagle 2 Pro's image just looks better than the others. It does way better in terms of dynamic range, especially the Foxeer. If we compare the Foxeer, and if you look at the dark part of the image here or the shadow on the ground, and then if we compare that to the Eagle, we can see way more detail in that area. The tree also, instead of being completely black, is kind of it's not quite a completely black blown out shadow from the sun. If we compare that to the Predator is also doing a pretty good job. Let's see if we can find another frame that demonstrates this really well here. For example, we've got a shadow on the ground, right? And if we go to the Eagle, we've also got shadow detail on the ground, but if we compare that with the Arrow, there's less shadow detail on the ground and just less detail overall. The Eagle and the Predator are higher resolution cameras, and that is certainly manifesting itself compared to the Arrow 2 Micro. Now, the Arrow 2 Micro, this is a micro, so it doesn't have the best lens on it, but it isn't that much worse, I think. In fact, I've been really surprised and impressed with how good the micro cameras look compared to their mini and full-size counterparts. If we look at the Monster, one of the biggest things I notice about the Monster is, number one, it has pretty good color rendition. So if we look at this frame from the Monster, we could see, nice sort of natural, a little bit neutral colors. Whereas the Eagle's colors, it's just a little bit more, I don't know, poppy is a way that you might put it. Where if we compare to the Predator also is just a little bit more natural. It feels like the Eagle is a little more aggressive with its wide dynamic range algorithm, and it's as a result you're sort of losing contrast and getting a little bit of an unnatural look to the image, whereas the Predator still has the wide dynamic range, but it's just a little bit more contrasty and a little bit more natural. And if we compare that to the Monster, notice the Monster's more zoomed in. That's to be expected because of the lens that's on it. The Monster is also doing a pretty good job with the colors. But here's what I didn't like about the Monster just the most. I found that the Monster was really having trouble with shadow detail. So if we compare, and if you look under the porch here, for example, on the Eagle, just look at it. It's got so much more detail here, and that's the wide dynamic range algorithm doing its job. And likewise, if we look at the Predator, it's doing a pretty good job, but not quite as good a job. For example, if you look right here at this front wall, the Predator is starting to lose detail in the shadows, whereas the Eagle is really retaining it. Now, we have to address the Predator's color cast. The Predator has a definite blue cast to pretty much all its images, and it's especially apparent if you compare it side by side against the other cameras. If you're just looking at the Predator here, especially on some of these frames, you could kind of forgive, you could barely notice it there. But the minute you go to the four side by side, you immediately see the blue cast on the Predator. Now, this is something that you can fix. The Predator does have settings to adjust the color gains, and you certainly could play with that. I am fully confident you could get a good color rendition out of the Predator, but mine, at least out of the box, defaulted a little too blue. I'm not going to ding the Predator for that because I'm so confident that it's fixable. This frame with these trees in the background, and especially maybe the trampoline, would be an interesting thing to look at. This is netting on the trampoline. Let's go to the Eagle. You can see, and it's especially if we just let the frame move a little bit, watch the trees, you can see the shimmering of the Eagle in the trees. And this is with the sharpening, and oh yeah, right here, hang on, let me go back. Right there in the grass, you could see it really bad. This is with the sharpening turned way down, and it looks right here. So that's probably the worst thing about the Eagle's image, and one of the things that I wanted to address was whether the Monster fixes that. Now, it's a little hard to do because the Monster is aimed up and you can't see the ground, but if we look at the trees, we can see it's absolutely way better on the Monster, way better. All that digital artifacting in the Eagle is just not present on the Monster. And if we can pan to the left a little bit, we can also see it's doing a better job not having kind of aliasing here on the fine details. So the Monster does have a much smoother image than the Eagle, even though it is a CMOS camera. If we look at the arrow here, we can see where the wide dynamic range algorithm of the CMOS cameras really benefits us and stands out. The arrow is struggling. We've got this reflected light here off of the wall, and the arrow is struggling to fit all of this into the image. Now, to be honest with you, I think it's doing a really good job. It's chosen to expose for the ground here. It's not letting the ground turn dark, and that seems like the right decision. But if we compare that to something like the Eagle has a more washed out image. It's less contrasty, but there's way, way, way more usable picture information. We can even see some of the details of the bricks here. Whereas if we go to the Predator, holy cow, the Predator is doing a great job. Even better than the Eagle here. It has, I mean, that's even better. Look at that. Look at the details right here. So here's a case where the Predator certainly has I think, beat the Eagle. Just in its overall exposure choice, it's exposing darker. The Eagle is getting more detail, especially if you're looking at the ground, but the Eagle has chosen to expose a little bit brighter. Now here's a test where I put my hand rapidly in front of the 4 cameras with the sun in the frame so that we could see how quickly their exposure algorithm adjusts to rapid changes in the light. And I do need to acknowledge again, I have made an adjustment to the Eagle 2 Pro. I've turned down its gain setting. The Eagle 2 Pro and the Eagle 2 have a terrible problem where the screen goes completely white if you don't adjust the gain setting. And I've turned it down. Let's take a look at how all these cameras do. So let's do that frame by frame. So here we're just a few frames out. We've got a little bit of a sync issue on the Monster. And we can see that even just a few frames out, the Eagle 2 Pro has already started to get there. But wow, look at the Predator. Wow, look how good the Predator did. In fact, the Predator, even just like right here, the Predator has already got the exposure dialed back in again and is fixing it. Has almost no problems. The Eagle 2 Pro with the gain turned down has done a good job. The arrow is blown out. And let's look at the Monster again, understanding that it's not completely synced. Here with the Monster, the hand is moving away. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 frames. The Monster is pretty quick, but not as quick as the Predator or the Eagle, and definitely not much quicker than the arrow. So I think for the rapid exposure change, the Predator wins, the Eagle is second, the Monster is a little bit of a distant third, and the arrow is basically not even hardly in the race. Finally, I want to show you this frame where I was looking at the underside of the trees. And by the way, this one, I think the arrow looks pretty good compared to the others. This is one of the places where I think it looked the best, is over here near this fence. But still, my gosh, could you even compare? Imagine that you took that blue cast out. If only there was a way I could do that. Well, I'm not going to tweak it, but yeah, Predator, Monster. Monster has a little bit softer image, but also none of that distortion. And then if we go over to the shadow, here's where the wide dynamic range really jumps out. This is the arrow. Now the Eagle. Look how much more detail you can see. Like if you look over here in this dark area, you can see individual pieces of wood here, whereas on the micro, no. Predator, no, not quite as good as the Eagle in the dynamic range, and the Monster. Now let's let that segue us into more footage of the Monster. Now the first thing I want to do is show you again an example of what the Monster does right, and this is what so many of you pointed out to me when I talked about the Eagle. This is the Eagle, and if we look down at the gravel, and the Eagle has the gain setting, is it turned down here or up? I don't know. But look how terrible this looks. We're looking at the gravel, and it's just really, the sharpening algorithm is really terrible. Look at all that shimmeriness. It's just awful. I mean, I live with it, but man, if your camera looked like this out of the box, I can see why so many of you would just immediately reject it. If we go to the Monster is, I just was stunned at how dark its image was. Even when we weren't looking at the sky, I mean, when the sky is in the frame, it goes really dark. And I tried adjusting my goggles and everything. I even tried adjusting the wide dynamic range algorithm. I just didn't find it to make much of a difference. I'll show you that in a minute. It was always really dark and really kind of muddy. Look at the house here. There's no detail here. And yeah, there's a little bit of sky in the frame, but it just seems to really be off on the exposure. Like I don't know, like the brightness needs to be turned up or something. However, if we look right here, there's none of that terrible shimmering. Maybe if you squint just right, you could see the tiniest bit. It's definitely doing way better at that. But just overall, the image looks really washed out, dull, muddy. Not very good. Here's me playing with wide dynamic range. I do think wide dynamic range made it a little better, but just nowhere. I mean, does this look like a fancy wide dynamic range awesome image? Not really. And even still, it's struggling. Look, it's struggling to get details out of the house. Just not blowing me away. I mean, this doesn't look that much better to me than a good CCD camera. So I just didn't see the magic. Here I was looking out at the trees here on the ridge line, and the trees on top are red and the trees on bottom are green, which I'll show you an image from a different camera so you can see what I mean. But again, it's just this muddy mass with no distinction. And I tried to play again with all the settings I could find. So here you can see me changing the exposure. You can see me changing the brightness. You get a little more shadow detail with the brightness at high, but it's just not doing anything. It's still no distinction there. Here, automatic gain control. What can I do I tried playing with everything to try to fix it. I just wasn't able to get a non-muddy image out of it. Here I'm changing the contrast. Nothing. By comparison, here's what the Predator showed for the same scene, and you can see very clearly that these trees on top are red. Red. We didn't see that at all in the Monster. Not at all. Where was that red? It just wasn't there. There you go. And for perspective, here's what the Eagle shows for the same scene. A little bit different image, but again, you can definitely see the red starting to come out when the green tree's beneath. There you go. There's a couple of the things I got to point out about the Predator before we go into the conclusion of the video. One of them is the Predator has a really cool feature that many of you are going to love, and that's the ability to flip the image both horizontally and vertically. And that's nice. Some people prefer to mount their cameras upside down for whatever reason. They like the wire coming out of the bottom, especially on a really tight build. Sometimes the wire coming out of the top is bumping on something. You want it coming out of the bottom. Also, depending on your frame, having the wire come out the bottom might make it easier for you to get in there and fish up in there if you need to do some kind of like a joystick or plug something into your camera. Well, many modern cameras, this used to be more common than it is, but modern cameras often don't seem to have this feature. They force you to mount the camera right side up. The Predator can flip the image, so that's really nice. The Predator doesn't have a ton of options in the menu. Many people will see this as an advantage. It's actually kind of simplified. It was a little bit of a relief to see that there were only like 5 things, and they're the things you really need. You might say, well, what about things like WDR or automatic gain control? And to that I say, if you get those things right out of the box, then you don't really need to give people the ability to tweak them. And the Predator does seem to do a pretty good job of that. The main thing about the Predator that I didn't like was the blue color cast, and you can adjust that away. So there you go. Between all of the cameras here, I feel like, well, let's set aside the Arrow for a minute because it's just in a different class, right? I feel like the Monster did the worst, and not just because of like the fact that it had a 2.5 millimeter lens. No matter what I did to the Monster's settings, I could not get rid of the really muddy image. I will admit that it had a better smoothness to the image. It didn't have the digital noise and artifacting that the Eagle does. So you guys who said the Monster doesn't, yeah, you were right. But the overall image quality of the Monster just looked really bad. So, I mean, hey, there you go. Between the Eagle and the Predator, that's a tough one for me. The Predator has less digital noise, but I feel like the Eagle's wide dynamic range algorithm really just is just that much little notch better than the Predators. However, the Predator does come in 4.3, and the Eagle 2 Pro is natively a 16:9 camera. Now you can set the Eagle 2 Pro to 4.3, but basically the image just gets cropped, so that's not ideal. And that brings me back to what I said at the end of the Eagle 2 Pro review, which is if you run 4.3 goggles, maybe you should be looking at an Eagle. But an Eagle 2, rather, not an Eagle 2 Pro. But the Predator really impressed me. It was super quick to respond to changes in lighting. You just could not fool its exposure algorithm. And overall, I think Foxeer really has a winner with the Predator, and I think many people are going to prefer it. I'm going to set the Predator up. I'm going to try and fix the color cast and just get the best possible looking. I mean, it's only fair I tweaked the Eagle. If I had shown you the Eagle with the sharpening at 6 instead of 3, it would have looked way crappier than it did. So I'm going to tweak the Predator a little bit. I'll maybe even put it on a quad and fly it, but that's going to be a video for another day. Thank you guys for watching. Tell me all the things I got wrong down in the comments. Yeah, I know. And happy flying.